Hey, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today as we talk about what people in our communities are thinking about the church and what they're expecting from us as church leaders. I've been doing a lot of research through many decades of my work here at Barna, looking at the perceptions of the church. I did a book called Unchristian, which really looked at the negative perceptions of young people towards the church. And we're going to dive into some of that today to really try to understand that. We heard earlier when Glenn was talking about listening and the power of listening. And I think that's part of what we want to exemplify in these forums is the effort that we want to aid for you as leaders who want to listen and listen well to your community. So lots of interesting things we're going to dive into here in a couple of minutes. What I want to say as we start is that it's all sort of available on this really cool poster, which I can sort of show you on my camera. We call it a city guide, front and back, lots of details. You can actually get all of this for free. The PowerPoints we're going to be showing you, as well as this downloadable 11x17, which you can print up and use as staff training or sort of different meetings that you're working on. And our goal is to help give you intelligence and insight as to what people are thinking right now so that you can minister more effectively both to the churchgoers in your community as well as the unchurched in your community. So we have 8 key findings that my colleague Savannah and I are going to unpack for you. So we're going to get started. So first of all, when we look at the overall perceptions of people in the community, and these are residents of South Florida, 18 plus, we find that people bucket into 3 different groups. And first, we have about 46% of South Florida residents who are positive towards the church. That's very consistent with national norms within the range of sampling error. 3 in 10 are indifferent, and 1 in 4 are negative towards the church. I actually think that negativity is a huge challenge, but indifference is in some ways is actually a more significant challenge. There's this like impregnable wall of indifference that people have, and actually many of those who say they're favorable are also sort of indifferent in their mindset towards the church, because certainly not that many are church goers in an active way. Let me show you one more detail here on this next slide, which gives you some picture of the kind of ways in which people are sort of feeling about, sort of those same 3 groups. And you'll notice that like looking at generations, right, you can see that 27% of millennials in South Florida have a negative view, slightly higher than older generations. You'll see on the far right, 3 columns, practicing Christians. So even 6% of practicing Christians have a negative view, 15% of practicing Christians have an indifferent view. And then you'll notice among non-practicing Christians how there's a sort of a step down. And then among non-Christians, and this is an important thing for the reputation of the church among those who don't follow Jesus, 21% are favorable, 33% are indifferent, and 46%, nearly half, are negative towards the church. So that's things are tough, but they're not as tough as we might imagine them to be in South Florida relative to the perceptions of the church. So I'm going to turn it over to Savannah to talk about our next finding.
Thanks, David. So yeah, as we continue this conversation, unpacking what people think of churches and pastors, we're going to talk a little bit about the quote unquote brand of the local church. So what do people see when they see the church in South Florida? What do they think? And so we see on this chart here that the data that we got back from South Florida is pretty much on par with national norms. And so top of the list right there is we perceive that the church offers hope to people. That's great news. I think we can definitely celebrate that. I want to draw our attention to this generous item, which is the 4th item. This was the one item in the list where South Florida lagged a little bit behind national norms. So maybe that's a spotlight, a scale, or a shovel for you to think through. Why is it that maybe people perceive us to be a little less generous? And then the negative views on the far right there with that red bar underneath. We see that the top negative views, the most frequently expressed negative views, are that the church is known for the things that they are against, judgmental, and irrelevant to me. Just things that we need to know. Maybe these are places where we should pause and reflect and ask ourselves, is this how my church is perceived? So we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about these negative views. David's going to go a bit more in depth here.
And as you think about those findings, again, through Barna Access, which is the free platform you can get when you sign up for the toolkit, you can actually slice and dice this data even more. You can be able to look at some of the ways in which unchurched people might have more negative views of churchgoers and the various generations. So we'll show you a little bit about that here in this next slide, where we actually demonstrate exactly how that might look if you use the toolkit. But here's an example of those brand perceptions of local churches sliced by generation. And you'll notice that especially this question of detached from the real issues my community is facing, millennials in South Florida are much more likely to believe that. And you can notice here on the other side, we have perceptions of local pastors. And among the other areas where millennials are sort of most skeptical of pastors is that top item on the list, which is that Christian pastors are out of touch with the needs of my community. And as we've been looking at, we're launching with 4 different cities. South Florida stands alone in the skepticism that millennials have towards those 2 items. It's a far greater sort of difference that we saw in this city than others. So this idea of, do millennials, and this is among all millennials, Christians and non-Christians, do they see pastors as in touch or detached? And you can see there's some negative challenges that the church in South Florida really faces among young people.
That's a great call out, David. Something for us to really reflect on as we lead in South Florida. So now on the flip side, let's talk about positive perceptions, right? It's not all bad news. So people definitely do have positive perceptions of local pastors in South Florida. We see on the left side of this chart that South Florida is on par with national norms, which is great news. But then on the right, I am going to focus more on the right side of this chart, which is churched versus unchurched in South Florida specifically. And we see a gap here. That's to be expected. Of course, people that are in the church are going to think more positively about the church in regards to things like, wow, our church has done a great job during the COVID-19 pandemic and so on, right? Of course. But I do want to call out that these numbers for the unchurched population in South Florida are actually pretty good. The majority of unchurched people in South Florida say that Christian pastors in my community have been strong leaders during the pandemic. 54% say Christian pastors in my community have been strong leaders when it comes to racial injustice. That's great news. That's the majority. So there definitely are some things in this data that we can celebrate. The perception is not all that bad.
So we've been covering in this first half of our time together, really, what do people think of churches and the brand perceptions of churches in South Florida. Again, I think it's a mix of good news and bad news. Again, when you double click and you look at certain segments, the younger people or non-Christians, there's lots of work for us to regain the credibility of the church, ways that we could demonstrate how churches are doing good. I often see in our research that millennials are interested, not just that the Christianity is true, but also that Christianity is good. And so with that in mind, let's dive into the second half of our findings, which relate to what people expect of churches. And so we've got one finding here for you where we look at what are the different ways in which people expect churches, would like to see churches active and involved in their communities. And you can see that South Florida residents actually are hopeful that churches would do a lot in their communities. There's a lot of sort of like, yes, we should see churches being active in these areas. This is what they would like to see. They're most likely to expect homeless services. That's top of the list. Companionship for the elderly, youth or children's events, and then counseling services, which I think is a really interesting sort of finding, especially in light of the fact that the conversations around mental health and emotional health continue to rise. I think we'll have a tsunami of grief and anxiety and mental health challenges coming out of the coronavirus. And so a great way for churches to show up with solid, effective ministry is counseling, in addition to the other things we're showing here. This shows the top of the list, the first 7 items, and then here is the bottom half of that list, other elements that people are asking for churches to provide, a little bit lower in terms of overall percentages, but these still represent, significant proportions of the community. Notice, for example, that work in local schools, millennials, you'll see that on the right side, it's 4th from the bottom. 28% of millennials in South Florida are interested in churches providing work in local schools. That's actually higher than Gen X and much higher than boomers. Again, all of these tools that we're trying to provide to you are meant to be a roadmap. We know that each ministry, each church is very unique, but use this data to try to help customize the way you think about the strategies that your church is using to reach out and show the good that God calls us to do in your community.
Great. Now to change gears a little bit, we just talked about specific issues, and now we're going to back up a little bit. Let's talk about flourishing overall. Over the course of these forums over the next couple of months, you're going to hear us use this term a lot, human flourishing. So we at Barna and in partnership with Glue have been studying these 5 dimensions of human flourishing: spiritual, financial, mental and emotional well-being, vocational, and relational, right? So we asked the people in South Florida if they were interested in seeing the churches in the area address these things, if that would be of interest to them. And on the left, you see the churched and the unchurched split in South Florida. And on the right, you see it split by generation. And the things I want to call out for us today, millennials are very interested in all of these things. When we frame up the conversation of growth with this language of well-being, in these various dimensions, millennials are very, very interested in South Florida. So maybe this is a spotlight, scale, or shovel for you as we think about engaging the next generation and combating some of those negative perceptions, right? Something for us to definitely keep in mind. And I also want to call out again, let's look at those dark red bars there representing the unchurched in South Florida. Those numbers are still pretty strong. So we definitely need to continue this conversation and think bigger about how churches can impact or even just be involved with these various dimensions of flourishing.
Thanks, Savannah. I remember one of my pastors through the years said that if Jesus doesn't matter in all of life, he doesn't matter in any of life. And I think that's a good demonstration of how young people especially are seeing the church as something they want to have a holistic, whole life discipleship. And I think a huge opportunity. And as you mentioned, we're going to continue to talk about that. A lot of the tools we've been developing with Glue help you as a church leader understand these different dimensions of flourishing. How are your people doing when it comes to these areas? And for me, pastor's son, someone who wants to see the church in South Florida, the church across the country, church around the world flourish. We want to see people flourish, and we want to help equip you as leaders to have the right framework for that. So on the next slide, we want to talk a little bit about, you got the right slide up there, thank you. On this slide, we've got issues that people are interested in preaching. And I want to just call out the fact that when we ask people, what do you want to hear about? There's an important way for us to parse the difference between what do people need to hear and what do they want to hear. Doing polling, I always feel that tension as a researcher. Just because people tell us, sort of what they want doesn't always necessarily mean what they need. But we do want to give you as leaders some sense of what's on people's minds when it comes to preaching topics. And by the way, on that last question, we asked, what would you want a local church to do in terms of preaching and programs? So it's, again, so interesting that young people in South Florida say, yeah, give us preaching and program on all of life. And so here's another way of looking at a more specific kind of topical approach. And again, this data is available for download, and you can use it in Barna Access, but you can look at differences. This is among all millennials, all Gen X, and all boomers, not just Christians. But morality and values was the top issue that people are interested in hearing about. And then you can see differences by young people. So they're more interested in morality and values, justice issues, social or political issues, heaven and hell, and end times, interestingly enough. Again, it's not a huge number, but 11% of millennials in South Florida are interested in end times. It was one of the few cities that particular generational difference popped. Again, I just want to sort of emphasize this idea. We're trying to help really shine a spotlight on young people in a lot of the findings. I believe the church is sort of woefully unprepared for millennials and Gen Z. So, but that doesn't mean that boomers or elders or any other generation, Gen X for that matter, doesn't matter. We just want to make sure you're kind of paying attention to the trends of younger people. But how can we minister to all of South Florida across all its beauty and brokenness, as Eddie mentioned at the very, very outset?
Well said. So now for our last data point for us to look at together, it's a pretty practical one. So hopefully you jot this number down on a sticky note or something. Ideal sermon length in South Florida. We see that the ideal sermon length that people report to us in South Florida is 36 minutes when they're in person and 32 minutes when they're online. I think statistically speaking, this is significantly a bit higher than the national norms. So that's something to keep in mind, but let's think about our own sermon lengths and how long we are asking people to pay attention to our teaching and preaching as we're hoping to keep them engaged. So hopefully that's just a really practical takeaway for you. And then on the next slide, we're going to cut this by generation. And we see it's interesting that boomer churchgoers are actually more likely to prefer short sermons. And younger generations often have more appetite for longer form preaching. Maybe that's a surprise to you. Maybe you would expect boomers to be the ones that wanted longer preaching segments, but that's not the case in South Florida. So something for us to definitely keep in mind as we're looking to engage, like David said, all generations and teach them well and lead them well.